Good morning, Alice. Good morning, Balearic Yacht Show. How are you?
We're good, thank you.
Good. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to kick off the virtual yacht show you've developed for Balearics. I must admit it's a very different feeling to what we're used to, and I miss it dreadfully. Normally, I'm standing on a big stage in front of lots of people. This is a new era. Hopefully, next year we'll be back to normal. So what I'm going to try and do is deliver a quick, punchy 35-minute presentation on what I call the future state of the market. I'm hoping to give you some interesting ideas, insights, and forecasts, but also maybe some things that you should all maybe look at as part of the industry's future, things that need to change or things that we should really address as a marketplace. The most important thing is that I ask this question every day about 2020, and obviously 2020 has been an exceptional year in so many ways. We've all suffered, we've all been affected by what is a fairly unprecedented time. I won't labor this too long. What I'm going to make sure we look at is exactly how we can address the future based on what I call a time to reflect being this 2020 pandemic year. A time to think, a time to consider what can we do smarter and more effectively. The nice thing about this situation is that I look very closely at something very important, is how many clients we are serving in our industry. And this is just a starter perspective I want to share with you all that really reflects on the total number of people in the world that we believe can be part of our industry, or can be part of our future industry, more importantly. So the world of wealth 2020 has been quite exceptional. And if you've been following them from the financial markets and following some of the rhetoric, there's been some losers, but there's been exceptionally successful winners in the last 12 months of the pandemic. We are now looking at a number from the WealthX data and the UBS private wealth data, about 300,000 people in the world who are called ultra high net worth individuals. That's worth 30 million plus. Now, the reason I say that number, 30 million plus, that means that they can get involved in activities like charter. And charter, I think, is a big part of our future. And something we have to look at very closely, both from the Balearic perspective and from the global perspective. We look at yacht ownership. So there are about 63,000 people in the world worth in excess of $100 million. And I feel they are the people that really fit into the real super yacht ownership category, where a yacht of 5 million up to 500 million becomes into the ultra high net worth, the very ultra high net worth category of 100 million plus, and going into the 8,000 individuals worth 500 million or more, i.e. the demi and the billionaire category, which is still very significant in the numbers that are out there and growing every year. Because what's interesting, if you look at the data that's coming out of the wealth sector, this is what they're saying, especially from people like the PwC, UBS, Credit Suisse, all the various wealth institutes and people like WealthX and Bloomberg. They expect 43,000 people to join that population. That's the 60,000 people in the next 5 years to be worth 30 million plus in the next 5 years. That's significant increase in number of people who are eligible and relevant to our marketplace. But there's a caveat to that. The caveat to that is very simple. Ultimately, okay, let me step back a minute. I've been in the market for 30 years. So I'm looking at the last 30 years in some of the data I'm going to share with you. But I'm also looking at the next 10 years into 2030, which I think is a fairly critical date on the timeline. What all the institutes are saying is that $15 trillion of wealth will be transferred by 2030. That's through death, retirement, passing on of assets and portfolios to the next generation. And the majority of that is in the very large upper tier. That is the billionaire category, because they are the eldest category of our wealth sector. So that's something you really need to consider, this next generation topic, and putting a date in our timeline of what's going to happen by 2030, because there's another criteria there that is key with 2030. That really relates to the UN Sustainability Goals deadline, which talks about sustainability and poverty and how we can make a better future for our next generation. So all these things tie into a very interesting picture of the potential we have as a marketplace. So I'm now going to talk about the market. So what I'm going to ask this question is, how big is the super yacht fleet and what does the future hold? So I'm going to try and paint a picture back to when I first started in yachting. When I started pre-1990, which is a long time ago for many of you, the fleet was 1,260 boats, give or take. By the end of this year, we should increase that beyond 5,700 yachts. So between 1990 and 2020, you can see the numbers quite clearly, 4,500 boats nearly built in that past 30 years. So we call that pretty much the active fleet. And if we look to 2030, we're expecting that to grow by another couple of thousand boats within the current trajectory we're seeing in terms of deliveries and new builds and other activities. So this is what's an interesting dynamic to look at, this 2030 landmark of what our market will look like in the future. Because when I look at pre-1990, we tried to discount a lot of these boats from what I call the interesting fleet, for the simple reason that a lot of those boats are either massively depreciated or even have asset values of less than €1 million. So they become very almost irrelevant to what I call the key super yacht category. What's also interesting is they become a fleet of yachts that almost clog up the system. They take up valuable real estate in marinas. They don't do very much. So that's something we have to address in the future as these boats get older and older. And it's not just the super yacht category, it's all categories of yachts that are over 30 years old. They get in the way almost of the next generation of yachts, being in primary real estate spaces in the popular marina destinations. So something we need to discuss or look at later on. The other thing we're looking at is this topic of pre-1990. There are some exceptions to the rule. I've listed 4 major yachts there, which we all know and we all love. Lady Mora Kingdom, Talitha G and Istros, a recent rebuild from Fedship that was built in 1954 and had a huge amount of money spent on it to bring it into a 2020 era. So these boats are still very significant and part of the aging fleet. But if you look at the bottom there, the majority of the yachts in that pre-1990 fleet are between 30 and 40 meters, and many of which are worth less than €1 million. So they have very low operating budgets and very low interest to quite a lot of our players, unless they're getting into that space of rebuilding and upgrading in other areas, which is another topic to discuss later on. So I've broken the market down into decades, the last 2 decades specifically, because I think it shows some interesting numbers here. And I won't read out the numbers in great detail, but you can see some of the annual growth rates per category that we saw pre-2010, when we had a fairly interesting bumper period, which we all remember well, when there's free cash and lots of investment in yachts of all shapes and sizes. So we saw some interesting growth. But what's interesting, when you break it down into the 60 to 90, the 90 meter plus category, you can see how small our market was back in 2000 and then in 2010. The numbers were quite limited in their sort of activity. But if we go into the next category of the last 10 years, we've certainly seen some interesting growth numbers continue, and we're seeing that the 60 to 90 and 90 plus is still on the same growth per annum category of 5 and 6%. So those numbers suddenly make interesting reading for the future. So when you start breaking this down, you start seeing a marketplace that is dominated in the bottom end between 30 to 40 meters with a majority, obvious majority of those production boats. But when you start breaking into these 40 to 60 and the other categories above there, you've got some interesting tonnage activity that is certainly where the majority of our market is getting excited, and that's where much of the infrastructure investment is geared towards. So those sort of things become interesting dynamics in what I call the active fleet. If I then go into the forecasting we're doing, this is where the numbers suddenly sort of start to show you what we think is going to happen based on trend analysis and forecasting, with a few adjustments for what's happening today. But we're still seeing that the 90 meter plus and the 60 to 90 meter plus is on a similar trajectory. So that is the market that gets very, very exciting, because the actual asset values are significant and everyone is getting certainly much more focused on that upper tier in terms of the refit market, the marina sectors, and also the service sectors. But let's not discount that lower tier of 30 to 40 and 40 to 60, which is clearly still very important for the future. That is the majority of our fleet by multiples of 10, and essentially become the market we have to make sure we're looking after, because that is what I call the feeder market for the future larger yachts. So this fleet forecast number suddenly suggests that by 2030, and that key landmark of wealth transfer, ultra high net worth growth, and also sustainability goals, we could have in excess of 7,500 very large 100-foot plus yachts. So that becomes a very exciting number in terms of what our industry has to service and support across the various industry landscapes. And this is on a global scale. But put that into context. We put this into context relative to the wealth numbers. This is the thing that I'm worried about, that we are still very limited on market penetration of potential client base. So we have to ask ourselves why, and we have to address this as part of our future strategy. That's happening all the time. There's things like the Water Revolution Foundation, the Superyacht Life Foundation, CMAS, the various boat shows have got a very clear strategy of how do we bring in new people. Because without new people, this market suddenly becomes a very stable, slow growth with, as you can see there, 130, 140 boats per annum being delivered or developing across the market space. But our potential marketplace is at least 8 or 9 times what we're really capitalizing on. When you consider that the new build market's delivering about 130, 140 boats a year, the brokerage market's selling about 200 plus boats a year, we're still doing very limited penetration in what I call the new client territories. And that comes down to questions we have to ask ourselves, which is why they don't buy yachts. That's another topic and we'll discuss in a minute. So one of the key things we're going to talk about is the refit and after sales market. Because obviously when you look at this in terms of Balearics and in terms of the Mediterranean, what we're seeing at the moment is a massive investment in infrastructure, upgrading of facilities, and a lot of players even coming into the market first time, or new build players upgrading their facilities to offer a refit or a rebuild scenario. So what we have to be careful with, and going back to the numbers we had earlier on, we have to realize that we can't all service the 60 meter plus market. The biggest growth areas are 30 to 40 and 40 to 60 in terms of volume of activity. So we have to balance this across the marketplace. We have to make sure that the market is almost managed in a way that we have multiple service centers that suit the different categories of yachts. I put a question on how can we improve the business model? So what it comes down to is a very simple question. Can we educate and can we advise the client to plan and organize their refit model or the refit cycle to be much more cyclical, annual, biannual, triannual, whichever sort of season process works for them personally. But we're still seeing a lot of refit work being last minute thought process or very last minute planning. And to me, this is something that really is conflicting with organizing our industry to make it more effective, more profitable, and deliver a much more organized service. It's been a constant conversation with lots of refit yards. Why aren't we planning ahead more of the refit or the service and after sales activity? And I feel that the word planning becomes a fundamental part of this conversation and this conference. Without planning, people cannot manage their businesses very well. That's the supply chain, the shipyards, etc. So we have to educate the market to really look at this from the point of view of how do we improve the business model by making sure that managers and captains across all size ranges deliver a better after sales cycle. And to me, that will definitely improve the way in which all our companies can plan, organize, service, and also deliver much more accurate budgets for the various after sales and service elements of the refit sector. It would help everyone, I promise you. Well, we all know that. Okay, the brokerage market. As I said earlier on, we have a huge network of brokers. We're only selling about 230 yachts a year. It's still a 2 billion plus revenue stream in terms of yacht sales, but it's still a very small number of people buying boats within the second-hand market. But what's interesting, and what we have to sort of take stock of, is that the pandemic and this year of 2020 has without question drawn attention to yachting. And we see people like MarineMax in America, who now own 2 very large super yacht brokerage houses, having incredible success in the smaller boat sales sector, because people are seeing yachts as this new private luxury bubble. And I feel that that is an interesting opportunity to reinforce the value proposition of yachting. It's happening already, and people have woken up to this fact. But I feel that the pandemic has drawn attention to the fact that yachting could be a future safe haven. However, when I talk about the next generation, I'm talking about the people who are currently the younger generation, who are part of our patriarchal owners network, who've been in yachting for maybe 20 or 30 years and love yachting. We have to be prepared that some of the next generation of these owners do not appreciate yachting or do not want to be in yachting in the way that their father or mother was. So I think we have to understand that there may be a shift where the next generation doesn't see ownership as a way forward, or they may not see ownership as something they are interested in. So to me, this is something we have to really address in terms of operating and offering a future opportunity for how to use a boat, not just own a boat. And I feel that's part of the charter industry, but also some other models that may come forward in the next few years, which I've been aware of, where you have fleet ownership, or you have people who've got yachts that are operating as a small fleet, actually selling access to the fleet on a time basis. Not timeshare per se, but different ways of using boats in the future, I think, will be part of the next generation. I'm not going to say Uberization, because that's an overused term, but I'm going to talk about this, that how to use a boat is going to be part of our future market, and how we sell that will be something we have to think about as an industry. I said earlier on, there's that huge number of people in the sort of the ultra high net worth 30 million plus category, huge number of people. And again, when you look at the pandemic year, we had a decimated charter industry. Cancellations, postponements galore. What will be interesting is as 2021 arrives, and as we see the arrival of vaccines and all the positive news coming out of government at the moment, let's hope that next May, June time, when the charter market starts to kick off, that we'll see a vaccine that is usable and viable and accessible to such a level that we can get back to a normal season or semi-normal season. However, the big issue is that everyone who booked a charter this year that's postponing it to next year, and all the people who are booked for next year, will mean we'll have a boom year, providing the vaccine works properly and we've got all our systems in place. So what we're seeing in 2021 could be the busiest charter season ever. So people will want to make sure they can have access to all the best cruising grounds, Balearics, per se, Greek islands, Turkish market, etc. So all these different regions, the Italian coastline, all these different regions, without question, will be busy next year. So we have to be ready for that. What we also have to do is make sure that everyone who charters next year becomes absolute ambassadors, that we looked after them to the ultimate level, and that the charter market was superb. It was the best holiday they've ever had, because I feel that we'll see a lot of new people consider charter as the super private escape from villa land-based holiday destinations or ultra luxury resort destinations. And yachting could become a boom charter industry if we get our let's say marketplace organized to service what could be a boom year next year. More importantly, going back to the 300,000 ultra high net worth people, that is where we need to focus our attention on what charter offers them, and then building what I call a model that allows more and more yachts to be available to make yachting suddenly become a business entity and a business enterprise, where people can actually generate not all their running costs, but some can definitely to cover all their costs if they operate effectively, but looking at this opportunity to become a much more untapped potential. And the charter industry makes places like the Balearics very, very active, exciting, and also delivers a huge amount of economic value to the region. So that's an important part of our untapped business opportunity. So the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen some very interesting things happen across the financial markets, not just activity on a global scale, but from a yachting perspective. We saw the GYG Pinmar flotation on the AIM listing. We've seen San Lorenzo float in the last 12 months, I think it is now, maybe longer. San Lorenzo certainly did a huge job of going around the world, presenting yachting to the various major stakeholders, investors, to say yachting is an interesting place to put your money. We've seen some very large private equity groups buy into shipyards, marina infrastructure across the Mediterranean and across the world. So what that means is that we become higher profile. And in essence, we have to maintain that we are a professional, stable marketplace. So some of the old ways of working do not make sense when the financial markets are watching what yachting is doing. Because I'll be very, very clear on this, is that the financial markets used to think of us as a bit of a cottage industry. They probably still do in some parts. But when someone like a CEO of a major shipyard goes to JP Morgan and says, listen, come into our marketplace, spend your money wisely and invest in a fantastic future shipyard, to the point that one of the actual private bankers at JP Morgan ended up buying a particular yacht as a result of that process. That's a good sign that people are seeing us as an interesting opportunity, not just from an investment point of view, but also from a lifestyle point of view, because a lot of those ultra high net worths look at the financial markets very closely, and they like to play in interesting market territories. So I think the investment market is getting more interested, but also more aware. And that's only a good thing, because the more people can raise capital, the more mature we can become as an industry, the better invested we are as a business place. And that's, from a long-term perspective, a very key part of stability. And I think that we have to focus on, or at least reinforce a lot more into how organized we are in terms of giving people insight and understanding of how a market performs. So this is a slightly controversial topic that I want to just talk about. And it's something that I think we talk about, that yachting costs X, but how often do we quantify the value of ownership versus the cost of ownership? And I feel that's something we have to work hard on as an industry, to reinforce what the value of ownership is, because we know it costs a huge amount of money. There are people out there, owners especially, who are now questioning the cost of ownership and asking their managers and their captains, can we reduce the cost of ownership by running a much tighter budget, or at least cutting costs on certain operational areas? So I feel that there's an opportunity. We have to change how we refer to the cost of ownership, to maybe reinforce it as the value of ownership, because it's not ever really a money-making exercise. But we have to also look at this as how can we add more value by reducing headaches, reducing negativity, and also delivering what I call the positivity that can come with a fantastic ownership lifestyle. So I feel that's something that, as an industry, at every single level, from the deckhand all the way up to the CEO of a major company, we have to look at how we can just keep adding more value to what ownership delivers our current owner network, but also our next generation, because the current owner network are essentially our ambassadors. They're the people that say ownership is wonderful, or they're the ones who say ownership is a headache. And we have to try and look at this as to how we can make sure the market looks at this as a value proposition, not as a cost. And that's just my sort of vision on how to change that perception. Everywhere you go now, the world of sustainability, or the topic of green, or the eco credentials is brought into the conversation. And I feel that this is a massive topic that we have to play a very key role on. It's not just about beach cleanups. It's not just about doing a little bit of, let's see, I use the word greenwashing carefully, by sponsoring something or partnering with something that may look a little bit green. We have to look at our next generation of client, because the younger generation, I'm talking people within the 20 to 50-year-old category, who are our next wave of real clients, are very focused on this topic from an investor perspective and also from a lifestyle perspective. So it's a big part of the conversation as to how we change perception. Promoting yachts that go at 30 knots with lots and lots of fuel consumption is a very archaic marketing and communication strategy. We have as an industry a responsibility now to change perception that yachting can be very acceptable and actually make a huge contribution by doing R&D into new technologies, by investing in green technologies, by investing in new ideas for the future, testing product on board yachts, but also the culture that relates to locations like the Balearics, like the Greek islands, which are stunning and beautiful. But when you look closely, there's still huge amounts of waste or pollution that we have to manage, because there's nothing worse than swimming around a boat in a small slick of oil or overspill or exhaust waste that changes people's perception that yachting is not the cleanest industry in the sector. It also, the sustainability topic relates to how we build and how we service yachts, how refit yards manage the waste or manage the excess or manage the materials that are taken off a yacht. All these things have to be more transparent and also have to be part of a promotion and a communication strategy to reinforce that how the yacht market is putting sustainability at the forefront of everything it does, because that changes perception very quickly. We have to remember that yachting is a very small ecosystem compared to aviation, cars or shipping, but we are very high profile, and the people that own these yachts have to be seen to be green in the future. Not today and not in the last few years, but I feel this is a big shift we have to take to make sure we change perception. One of the sessions I'm doing on Friday as a closing keynote is about this very topic, about can the Balearics set a new standard in terms of how they approach sustainability and become the greenest super yacht hub in the market. That should be an interesting conversation because I feel it's achievable. And on the scale of the Balearics, with Ibiza and Mallorca and all the other various areas around it, it's a controlled environment that can become very, very effective in terms of setting a new standard. Not following a regulation, but setting a new standard is really the message. So this, I think, is a very key part of our future. And everyone at every level should be thinking, how can we make ourselves more positive as an industry so that perception can be more positive at the same time. Now, this is a key factor. I've got about 10, 15 minutes left. There's a key factor. And I'm not referring just to myself, but there's a lot of people who are at the top of this marketplace who have been running the industry for the last 30 years, who are all falling into their 60s and 70s and beyond. And I think this is a key part of our conversation. Who is going to take the lead and what is the succession plan? Because there's two things that happen. We've grown up as an industry with lots of what I call patriarchal figureheads who've run companies. The brokerage company, the shipyards have all been run by very successful, very, very opportunistic entrepreneurs who've grown up with the market. And finding people to take over and finding people to lead in the future will be a key factor as to how we grow and how we develop. The second part of this topic is also looking at this whole conversation from the operational side. We have a lot of very, very successful yacht captains, and most of the people in this yacht captain fraternity have gone into what they call a mentorship level. They are the people who've either come ashore and doing project management or owner representation or other activities. But I think there's a whole new generation of people that have to come through, and we have to make sure that those people, the next generation of the successors, if you like, who are going to run the fleet and be part of that future industry, are being mentored by the people who've been through the last 10, 15 years. And we share and we develop the next leaders of our marketplace. Because the next 10 years, as I go back to this 2030 deadline, there'll be quite a few people who will be looking to retire and looking to step back from this marketplace. And we need to make sure we've got the right people with the right vision for the future. And that's another key factor we have to look at as an industry across the wider network of companies. I go back to this topic again, human capital. I think going back to the MarineMax reference I made and going back to the brokerage industry and how we can capitalize on the number of buyers, potential buyers in the marketplace. What's interesting is if we increase our sales capacity and sales success, we need the right number of people to come into the market who can run this fleet. And I feel we need to find the right people for the next generation of crew, of captains, of service people that can actually look after the fleet. We've certainly got a historical sort of dynamic of short-term career paths. We need to change that to make sure that there's a stable career path. It's much more organized. The contractual obligations are much more in favor of the employee. And we create what I call an employment landscape which is more realistic and more representative of the real world and not the yachting world. I feel this is something we have to change, because it's not fun having the stress of working on a yacht, which you can lose your job the next day and have no recourse or no real protection. There are obviously contracts that exist, but it's very hard to sometimes enforce some of those elements and protect the people that have done the job and lose their job overnight, which is something I feel is very unfair in our market. And we need to create that stability by giving a better employment landscape. So the human capital is key. We need plenty of people for the future, but we need to make sure they have a career path that is stable and also, let's say, professional in their approach, both the employment side and the employee side. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Okay, this is another thing I just threw in there for the last couple of slides. Staying relevant. I think if you look at the wider industry and you look at the way in which architecture's going, shipping's going, automotive's going, the various lifestyle choices the ultra wealthy are making, with philanthropy as a key element of their lifestyle, but also investing in things that actually make sense for them and they actually find very interesting. I have a fairly sort of controversial statement. Sometimes it can be very boring sitting on a yacht for 2 weeks, watching movies, drinking, eating, sunbathing, and maybe chatting with people you don't really want on board. So I feel we have to make sure we make yachting really make sense in terms of it's actually interesting to be on board, and the places you go are interesting, and you can do things that are unique and different. So I feel there's a new generation there where yachting will suddenly want to be not just sitting at anchor somewhere in a beautiful bay, but they want to actually be having a little bit more of an interesting activity that is beyond what is our status quo of cruising habits and itineraries. So I think we have to make yachting really interesting, because a lot of the world's wealthy next generation are doing some pretty exciting stuff that is really off the beaten track, or certainly doing things that are a bit more challenging, a bit more dynamic, a bit more exciting and adventurous. So we have to be relevant, and that's something that I think the market is certainly putting some explorer discovery type projects out there, but we have to make sure that they can go and do these cool things with the right level of support and the right infrastructure. So this is something that's very, very key, is remaining relevant for the future. Okay, so this is the final slide. I made a few comments and statements about the real potential of the number of buyers, the people who really can be involved in this marketplace. I'll be very, very clear. I am absolutely optimistic about the future, for the simple reason that we are higher profile as an industry than we've ever been before. Going back to the investor topic, we're on the markets now with various players who've been brave enough to launch on stock markets. That puts yachting in front of a lot of people who can afford to buy into this space. There are various investors coming in, private equity, venture capitalists, who are really moving to the market and seeing opportunity. To me, that suggests that we are becoming not acceptable to the financial markets, but interesting, a new dynamic. And when MarineMax bought into the two large brokerage houses, and that is a vast company on the New York stock market that is very, very exciting, growing at huge relevant numbers, that suddenly puts yachting right front and center into the eyes of people who are spending a lot of money in the stock market. The bankers, the investors, the private individuals with big portfolios, the family offices. So what all that means is our future could be very bright, but I feel we have a lot of things we have to almost address, which I've highlighted, that will actually make the industry slightly more robust and let's say service-oriented, value propositions mapped out, career paths mapped out for people that can come into yachting and stay in yachting, not just see it as a short-term opportunity. And we make sure that the owners see value, not just cost. And I feel the future is quite bright. And what I'm hearing from the lawyers, from the designers, from the brokers, and from the shipyards is that there's a huge amount of discussion today about new projects, new contracts, sale and purchase agreements. They seem to be busier than ever. And that has also been translated into things like the tax people who I'm talking to this week on one of the sessions, whereby the tax advisors are being very busy on ownership structures and tax landscapes for them. So today we're seeing a very interesting activity. The future is about how we capitalize on the number of people that see yachting and make sure what they see is an attractive proposition and something worth investing in. So if we keep focused and we stay working together, I think we have a very interesting 10 years ahead of us. So on that point, Alice and the Balearic Yacht Show, have a good yacht show. Thank you very much. I'm here for conversations or chats or questions if anyone has anything to say. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll just stay on for another 5 minutes or so in case someone has any specific questions. You can either write it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask Martin directly. Apologies, I believe you can't unmute yourselves, but if you just raise your hand in Zoom, then I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask a question.
I think everyone's happy.
Hello, Martin. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So my question is, you said that the yachts industry needs to offer something else, not just yachts thing, okay? And you've been talking about, for example, the Balearic Island. And my question is, what can for example, the institutions, the governments, what can they do to help us to create, I don't know, maybe a wider space for everyone? I mean, if you are saying don't just go yachting, just go out and do something else. So who can help us with this?
You're talking about the government's supporting the industry and being ready to invest or present opportunity for this growth opportunity. I think what's interesting is what has happened certainly in the last 5 years, from my experience, Lewis, is that you're looking at a situation where governments are waking up. We've been doing a lot of research and a lot of analysis for governments in the last 10 years on the value of yachting. And people are expecting to attract more and more yachts to their locations. And I know the Balearics has got a very clear strategy on that. To me, the most important thing here is that governments have to recognize that the infrastructure required, the industry that supports this fleet, are made up of lots of entrepreneurs and small companies and people that need what I call government support. So I feel that what the governments need to do is listen and learn and adapt in support of the industry, and not to be on both sides of a table, but to work together. And I feel that's one of the things that we're seeing evolving in the marketplace today. Because if you look at the number of boats which will be here in the next 10 years across the wider fleet, and what could accelerate beyond that, we're certainly seeing a place where we need to make sure that yachts are invited and welcomed without any barriers or without any headaches. And I feel that's one of the key things, that yachts are not just the billionaire. They have an ecosystem and an infrastructure and an economic value that needs to be respected and serviced. And I feel that's another part of the education topic of helping government understand the value of yachting. And it's not just this, sometimes you have social governments that don't like the idea of looking after big yachts. That is definitely changing across the landscape. So I feel there's an interesting shift in how governments of realizing what yachting brings, but also how to work with yachting. And I think that's a positive step.
I think we have another question now from Nigel. So I'm just going to unmute him. That should be it.
Good morning, Martin. Thanks very much for that. My question is regarding carbon offset for the fleet, and has there been any progress, or what's the uptake on carbon offset, and is there any updates?
Can I be slightly controversial, which I occasionally like to be? I'm not a big fan of carbon offsetting, but I feel that there are better ways of our industry being more sustainable and more focused on the next generation of product and the way in which we run our fleet. I think if the carbon offsetting is highly transparent and well managed, there are some opportunities there. But as part of what I call my board responsibility with the Water Evolution Foundation, I'm not sure that carbon offsetting is the way ahead for our industry. I think we just have to run a much tighter operation in terms of how we focus on the green or the eco topic. In terms of other things we can do, the fact is that so much technology available today, so many systems and solutions available today, that I feel we're in a position to really up our game on the sustainability topic. And I feel that that's got to be our mission, not just to say, I've got an expensive yacht burning all this fuel, but I'm actually offsetting here. I think that's a slightly incongruous, contradictory type process. That's just my view, my personal view.
Sure. Local initiatives, more addressing more local initiatives, perhaps.
I think on that topic, let's talk about local initiatives. I think without question, if you look at the Balearics and a beautiful location like the Balearics, you think about the amount of wind energy that's probably blowing across the island. You look at the amount of solar energy. There's so much opportunity within what I call the local infrastructure, the shipyards and the marinas especially, to create opportunities that can be developed as efficient programs. Shore power consumption, rather than using generators in harbour. These things are definitely coming fast into the market. So I feel that we've got to look at this as being the way in which we change our marketplace to apply next generation thinking. A marina is sitting there 24/7 with some fantastic wave, wind and solar power that could be capitalized upon. But also there's other more efficient energy systems that can produce better shore power for the larger yachts, which I know is one of the problems we have in marinas. Shipyards as well, they have lots of opportunities to create green energy support and other things.
Super, thanks very much indeed.
Okay, well, we've only got 2 minutes left, so if there's any quick questions, otherwise we're going to move on to the next conference.
Okay.
I don't see anyone else's hand raised, so I think we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much indeed, and good luck with the rest of the show. I'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow at 4 p.m. Yeah, perfect.
Right, take care.
Thank you, Martin. Bye.